The legacy of the American Vietnam veteran is widely misunderstood. Most schools do not teach it. Even many Vietnam veterans who know what they did, of course, don't appreciate the legacy that they helped create. They don't know how what they did in Vietnam will be remembered in American history. This video helps set the record straight. The starting point is to appreciate just how controversial the Vietnam War was at a political level. Prior to World War II, Vietnam had been a French colony. The Japanese occupied Vietnam during World War II. When Japan withdrew from Vietnam, the Vietnamese, in line with self-determination, declared independence. The French said, no, you don't. No independence for you. The French sent its military into Vietnam to prevent the independence of Vietnam, leading to what came to be referred to as the French Indochina War. After the French withdrew, the United States filled in that vacuum and national elections were never held. Now we're viewing Vietnam as a microcosm in the global Cold War, a microcosm in the global competition between democracy and communism. We came to view Vietnam as being proxies for the communist Soviet Union, proxies for the communist China, and essential that we stop communism from spreading any further right here. If we lose Vietnam, communism will spread to Thailand, the so-called domino theory. So that's just a little bit of highlight of the view of Americans who supported American public policy in Vietnam and thought this is a key battleground, we have to win it. That's number one. On the other side of the argument were those who said, this isn't about the Cold War, this is about freedom fighters. This is about Vietnam's desire to govern itself and to have no foreign occupiers. And if you viewed the Vietnam War through that lens, the United States had no business being there and was on the wrong side of the fight. There were good arguments supporting both views, and that then led to the controversy. Now, the controversy was aggravated and became far more emotional, in part because of the draft. During the Vietnam War, the United States experienced the largest, most widespread, most frequent anti-war protests of any time in American history. Tensions were so high, Army National Guard shot and killed anti-war protesters. You often hear comment that the Vietnam War tore the country apart. It was just an unprecedented upheaval in the history of American freedom. Let's talk about the profile of Americans serving in combat in Vietnam. The average age of Americans deployed to Vietnam was 21 years old. That's an average. So obviously there's a senior officer corps, there's a number of career professionals that raise the average age, so to speak. A lot of Americans serving in Vietnam were 19 years old, some were as young as 17 years old. Can you imagine being a high school student? It's your senior year of high school. You're thinking about, well, what am I going to do when I get out of high school here? I might take a year off, I might go to college, I might learn a trade, I might go directly into the job market, but not very many high school students would imagine 1 year from now, I'm going to be in combat in the jungles of Vietnam. Now think about the background of Americans who deployed to Vietnam. A lot of Americans grew up in a city, even the inner city. A lot of Americans had never been out of the inner city. Others grew up in a suburb. Others grew up in small towns, farms, or ranches, but nobody, for all practical purposes, not a single American who deployed to Vietnam to enter into combat, grew up in a jungle. And yet here they are, a completely foreign environment. They're fighting an enemy that was absolutely at home there. They're fighting a professional, hardcore enemy. The enemy in Vietnam consisted of two different types of warriors, the North Vietnamese regular army and then the Viet Cong, or the guerrilla fighters that lived in South Vietnam, that blended in with the South Vietnamese population. And Americans in combat in Vietnam could not tell the difference between a civilian in South Vietnam and a Viet Cong guerrilla. No matter where you were in the field of combat. If you were fighting against the North Vietnamese regular army, they were hardcore, well-trained, well-equipped professional soldiers. They came down into South Vietnam along the Ho Chi Minh Trail that went through Laos, went through Cambodia, gave them then a port of entry into South Vietnam. And if you came down the Ho Chi Minh Trail to enter the fight as a North Vietnamese soldier, you stayed for 10 years. And you were fighting with the benefit of lessons learned through multiple generations of Vietnamese fighters. The Vietnamese fought the Japanese during World War II, then they fought the French in the French Indochina War, now they're fighting the Americans. Our adversary was used to fighting an enemy with superior firepower. Our enemy perfected jungle warfare. Our enemy had a very developed infrastructure in the jungles of Vietnam. They had underground hospitals, underground recreation centers, they had tunnel systems, they had the ability to create clever booby traps that Americans just coming over after graduating from high school were poorly equipped to recognize and deal with. So this was a tough adversary. Not only did our American Vietnam veterans fight in the jungles and fight in tunnels, but they fought on rice paddies, they fought in the Mekong Delta, they fought on helicopters, they fought in an urban setting. During the 1968 Tet Offensive, Vietnam veterans fought in more than 100 different population centers, including the then capital city of Saigon, today Ho Chi Minh City, without specialized training to do so. They had to make up their tactics with their lives at stake. Given the truth of all of these circumstances and all of these challenges, all of these obstacles, how did Americans serving in Vietnam do on the battlefield? Every single Vietnam veteran came home a battlefield winner. Americans in combat in Vietnam won every major battle. They accomplished every major military mission given to them. It would be a big mistake to think that because American politicians made a decision to withdraw from Vietnam in 1973, that Vietnam veterans lost the war in Vietnam. It's very analogous to the American withdrawal from Afghanistan. There's not anyone who lived through the American war in Afghanistan who think that our Afghanistan veterans came home losers. The fact that the administration decided to completely withdraw remaining American troops in Afghanistan takes nothing away from the battlefield valor, the battlefield success of every single American who served in combat in Afghanistan. It's exactly the same with respect to Vietnam veterans. What did it cost our Vietnam veterans to come home battlefield winners? What sacrifice, what price did our Vietnam veterans pay? It might surprise you to hear that our Vietnam veterans as a whole suffered a higher rate of casualties than any other group of veterans in American history. Our Vietnam veterans suffered about a 1/3 casualty rate. More than 58,000 Americans lost their lives in Vietnam. Their names are recorded on the Vietnam Memorial Wall. In addition, another 153,000 Americans serving in Vietnam were wounded severely enough on the battlefield to be hospitalized with their wounds. You have to add to that our Agent Orange casualties. Now, this video is not about the legacy of Agent Orange in Vietnam, but let me say just enough about it to make sense. From 1962 until 1971, the United States sprayed 20 million gallons of Agent Orange on the jungle in Vietnam. The whole time we're assuring all of the Americans in that jungle that this defoliant is harmless to human health, and it wasn't true. It was actually a deception. The chemical companies knew and disclosed you can't manufacture Agent Orange without unavoidably having a byproduct of trace amounts of a particularly deadly form of dioxin that goes by the initials TCDD. TCDD is so hazardous to human health, exposure to as little as 3 or 4 parts per million can cause cancer, can cause severe birth defects, can cause a long list of other diseases. American leadership at some level decided it's worth poisoning our Americans in Vietnam in exchange for short-term gain on the battlefield. When the war's over, surviving Vietnam veterans are back home. They're dying of cancer at higher rates than anybody else. They're having children with birth defects like spina bifida at higher rates than anybody else. They're having a long list of other diseases at higher rates than anybody else in an age-matched population. And so the question came up, well, how come it's just Vietnam veterans that must tie to our military service? To add insult to injury, not only did we make the cynical decision to poison Americans in combat in Vietnam, But once they came home, we gaslighted them, we stonewalled them. We said, this has nothing to do. Your illness, your death, your disability, your birth defects have nothing to do with your service in Vietnam. You get no disability. There is no medical research into optimum care for Agent Orange casualties. And that was the case from the time we started spraying Agent Orange in 1962 until Congress acknowledged what I've said to you, passing the Agent Orange Act of 1991. Now, since Congress passed the Agent Orange Act of 1991, our research shows more than 650,000 Vietnam veterans have been treated as Agent Orange casualties. Now, keep in mind, 650,000, big number, but keep in mind, that's an undercount. That does not include anyone who came back from Vietnam who suffered from Agent Orange, who died of any reason prior to 1991. But we don't have the complete number, and we're not going to make up a number, so we'll use this number of 650,000, knowing it's too small. Add 650,000 to those wounded in action, those killed in action, you've got over 850,000 casualties. You have to add to that post-traumatic stress casualties. We don't know the complete number of post-traumatic stress casualties suffered by our Vietnam veterans, but we do know the VA's number for how many Vietnam veterans were still suffering from post-traumatic stress in 2019. That number is 271,000. That number is far too small. It doesn't include anybody who came back from Vietnam suffering from post-traumatic stress who died of any reason prior to 2019. Worst of all, it doesn't include any Americans who came back from Vietnam suffering from post-traumatic stress who committed suicide. They, in effect, died because of their service in Vietnam. They did not get their names put on the Vietnam Memorial Wall. So if we just add 271,000, knowing it's far too small, it's probably closer to 1 million. But we don't know that, not going to make it up. Let's just add 271,000 to more than 850,000 casualties. Well, that's between 1.1 and 1.2 million casualties out of 3.4 million Americans deployed to all of Southeast Asia in the 20 years ending our evacuation from the American Embassy on April 30th of 1975. That's a 1/3 casualty rate. That is an unprecedented price for any group of American veterans to pay as a result of their service on behalf of the United States. Given these truths about the legacy of our Vietnam veterans, how did we then treat our Vietnam veterans when we came home? Well, shame on us who did it, shame on us who permitted it to happen. This is a black eye in the history of American freedom. When our Vietnam veterans came home, because of the political controversies about the Vietnam War, because there was so much hostility in a portion of the American people toward American public policy in Vietnam, a lot of war protesters vented on our Vietnam veterans, took out their hostility on our Vietnam veterans. And I don't just mean anecdotally, I mean systematic, widespread. The anti-war movement organized to have protesters waiting at every single commercial port of re-entry for Vietnam veterans returning home directly from the battlefields of Vietnam. San Francisco Airport, Seattle Airport, Denver, Los Angeles Airport. And their training and their script was, as soon as you see those Vietnam veterans come into the terminal, and remember, a lot of these are draftees. They didn't want to be there. They're traumatized. They lost buddies. They might have lost limbs. We've got Vietnam veterans coming home in wheelchairs, coming through these commercial airports, having war protesters rush up to them, mock them, spit in their face, call them baby killers. Just harass them until they get out of the airport. And then once they get out of the airport, they're back home. Well, Vietnam veterans were warned, don't appear in public in your uniform. How would you like to be a 20-year-old combat veteran who, instead of being thanked and appreciated and welcomed home and supported and transitioned back to civilian life after that kind of trauma for that long of a period of time and that kind of interruption to the rest of your life, how would you like to now have to hide it, like you've done something wrong rather than you've done something honorable that deserves to be appreciated? This brings us back to where the video began. What's the real legacy of the American Vietnam veteran, several things come to mind. First, Vietnam veterans answered their country's call to duty and served the United States in accordance with the finest traditions of American patriotism. Second, our Vietnam veterans fought a very tough adversary in almost impossible conditions in the jungles of Vietnam and came home winners. Third, Vietnam veterans paid a higher price as a group in terms of overall casualty rate than has been paid by any other group of veterans in American history. Fourth, our Vietnam veterans came home to the worst mistreatment afforded any group of American combat veterans returning home, and resolved not to let that happen to anybody else. When combat veterans came back from Iraq, from the Gulf Wars, from Afghanistan, Vietnam veterans were front and center on making sure to provide an appropriate reception to these returning American heroes. And now here's the bottom line. To every single Vietnam veteran and to the immediate family of every Vietnam veteran, welcome home. Thank you for your service. What you did will be remembered. Your stories, your valor, and your sacrifice have been recorded and will forever be a part of the history of American freedom.